Blackwells Triumph. When her brother was captured, Lady Isolde of Evermere had no choice but to seek help from Sir Aldrich Blackwell, the mercenary knight known for his ruthless heart. He studied her from across the fire, his smirk slow. "You ask for my help, my lady," he murmured. "But tell me, how much will you sacrifice to earn it?" Chapter 1. The Falcon's Flight. The wind whipped at Lady Isolde's dark hair, strands escaping the confines of her braid as she urged her mare, "Fail on, onward." The forest of Evermere, usually a sanctuary, felt menacing today, the dense canopy above casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the fading afternoon light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of Phelan's hooves against the muddy track. The news had reached her only hours ago, delivered by a breathless, mud-splattered messenger, her brother, Lord Edric, captured. Captured by the treacherous Lord Morian, a man whose ambition was as boundless as his cruelty. Isolde clenched her jaw, the taste of fear bitter on her tongue. Edric, her twin, her other half. The thought of him in Morian's clutches sent a wave of icy dread through her veins. Evermere, their ancestral home, stood proud and strong, but its defenses were no match for Morian's seasoned army, bolstered by alliances forged in darkness and deceit. She needed help, and she needed it swiftly. There was only one man who could possibly offer it, a man whose reputation was as dark and dangerous as the forests that bordered their lands. Sir Aldrich Blackwell. The name itself conjured images of shadowed battlefields, whispered tales of ruthless efficiency, and a heart rumored to be forged of the same cold steel as his infamous blade. He was a mercenary, a sellsword, owing allegiance to no one but himself and the weight of gold. Yet, he was also known for a peculiar, twisted sense of honor, a code that he adhered to with the same unwavering ferocity he brought to the battlefield. It was this sliver of hope, this fragile thread of reputation, that Isolde clung to as she rode. She had sent a missive to him weeks ago, anticipating the growing threat from Morian. A desperate plea, masked beneath layers of formal courtesy, offering him a substantial sum for his services in defending Evermere. He had not replied. Now, with Edric's capture, she could no longer wait for a written response. She had to seek him out, confront him, and beg for his aid, whatever the cost. The air grew colder as she ascended the winding path that led to Blackwell's Keep, a stark, forbidding structure that clung to the cliffs overlooking the turbulent northern sea. Ravens circled overhead, their harsh cries echoing the turmoil in Isolde's soul. She pictured Edric, his bright smile, his easy laughter, now replaced by the grim reality of Morian's dungeons. The image fueled her resolve, steeling her spine against the apprehension that gnawed at her. As she approached the gates, two guards, clad in black leather and steel, emerged, their faces grim and unyielding. They were as imposing as the keep itself, their eyes, hardened by countless battles, assessing her with a cold scrutiny that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Lady Isolde of Evermere," she announced, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I seek an audience with Sir Aldrich Blackwell." One of the guards, a hulking man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, grunted. "The Knight Commander is not expecting visitors." Isolde straightened her shoulders, drawing upon every ounce of her noble upbringing. "Tell him it concerns Lord Edric of Evermere. Tell him he is captured." The guard's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise, but his expression remained impassive. He exchanged a glance with his companion, then nodded curtly. "Wait here." Isolde waited, the wind whipping around her, the cold seeping into her bones. She wrapped her cloak tighter around herself, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors of the keep. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the unseen clock amplifying her anxiety. Doubts began to creep in, whispers of fear that questioned her decision. Was she foolish to trust a man like Blackwell? Was she placing her brother's fate, and her own, in the hands of a man who might be as dangerous as the enemy she sought to defeat? Finally, the doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior and the silhouette of the scarred guard. "The Knight Commander will see you." Isolde drew a deep breath, the air thick with a scent of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and faintly unsettling, like the lingering smell of blood. She stepped inside, the heavy doors closing behind her with a resounding thud that echoed through the vast hall. The sound seemed to seal her fate, to mark a point of no return. She was committed now, bound by a pact yet to be made, a pact forged in desperation and sealed in blood, if need be. She walked forward, into the heart of the darkness, her eyes searching for the man who held the key to her brother's freedom and, perhaps, to her own destiny. The mercenary knight, Sir Aldrich Blackwell. She would face him, and she would not falter. Not while Edric's life hung in the balance. Her heart pounded. Chapter 2. A Mercenary's Price. The great hall was cavernous, the high, vaulted ceiling lost in shadows. A fire roared in the massive hearth at the far end, casting flickering light on the tapestries that adorned the stone walls, depicting scenes of battles long past, victories hard won. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the ever-present undercurrent of steel. A long, rough-hewn table dominated the center of the hall, littered with maps, half-empty tankards, and the remnants of a recent meal. And there, seated at the head of the table, bathed in the firelight's glow, was Sir Aldrich Blackwell. He was not what Isolde had expected. The rumors had painted him as a brute, a savage warrior with eyes as cold as the winter sea. While his presence was undeniably imposing, there was a surprising refinement to his features. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his life in the saddle and on the battlefield. His hair, the color of raven's wings, was tied back from his face, revealing a strong jawline and high cheekbones. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were not cold, as she had been led to believe, but rather a deep, intense blue, the color of a storm-swept sky, and they burned with an unsettling intelligence. He was studying her, his gaze unwavering, assessing her with the same cool detachment he likely used to evaluate an opponent on the battlefield. He wore a dark, unadorned tunic, the leather worn and supple, and a heavy sword belt rested across his hips, the hilt of his infamous blade glinting in the firelight. There was no outward display of wealth or power, yet he exuded an aura of command that was undeniable. Isolde approached the table, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She met his gaze, forcing herself not to flinch under his scrutiny. "Sir Aldrich," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I am Lady Isolde of Evermere. I thank you for granting me an audience." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. There was a faint amusement in his eyes, a subtle curve to his lips that hinted at a sardonic nature. "Lady Isolde," he replied, his voice a low rumble, rich and resonant. "You arrive unannounced, and at a rather inconvenient hour. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Isolde bristled at his tone, but she reminded herself of her purpose. She could not afford pride now. "My brother, Lord Edric of Evermere, has been captured by Lord Morian." She spoke the words plainly, letting the stark reality of the situation hang in the air. Aldrich's expression did not change, but a flicker of something interest, perhaps, crossed his eyes. "Morian," he murmured, almost to himself. "A viper with a taste for power. And you believe I can assist you in retrieving your brother?" "You are known for your skills, Sir Aldrich," Isolde said, choosing her words carefully. "Your reputation precedes you. I am prepared to offer you a substantial sum for your services." He raised an eyebrow, a slow, deliberate movement. "Substantial?" he echoed. "My services are not cheap, my lady. War is a costly business." "I am aware of that," Isolde replied, her voice tight. "I have brought with me a chest of gold, and I am prepared to offer you more upon my brother's safe return." He studied her from across the fire, his smirk slow, almost predatory. It made a chill run down her spine, a sense of unease that she fought to suppress. He seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade, to the desperation that lay beneath. You ask for my help, my lady, he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the sound sending unexpected shivers through her. But tell me, how much will you sacrifice to earn it? The question hung in the air, heavy and fraught with unspoken meaning. It was not merely about gold, she knew. He was probing her, testing her resolve, seeking to understand the depths of her commitment. He wanted to know how far she was willing to go, what she was willing to risk. Isolde met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. Everything, she said, the word a vow, a promise, a desperate plea. I will sacrifice everything to save my brother. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by that unsettling, knowing smirk. He leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his eyes, making them seem almost predatory. Everything is a heavy word, my lady. A word that carries consequences. He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his size. He circled the table, slowly, deliberately, like a wolf stalking its prey. Isolde held her ground, refusing to show any sign of fear, though her heart pounded against her ribs with a force that threatened to suffocate her. He stopped in front of her, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of leather and steel that clung to him. He reached out, and for a moment, she thought he was going to touch her. But his hand stopped just short of her face, his fingers hovering near her cheek. Loyalty, he murmured, his voice a low, husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. Duty, honor. These are words that men often speak, but rarely understand. You speak of sacrifice, my lady, but are you truly prepared to pay the price? His gaze was intense, penetrating, stripping away her defenses, exposing her vulnerabilities. She felt naked before him, exposed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under his scrutiny. I am, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. She knew the price of war. It was paid in blood, in loss. He lowered his hand, his eyes still locked on hers. Then we have a pact, Lady Isolde, he said, his voice firm, decisive. I will help you retrieve your brother. But know this, my loyalty is earned, not given. And it comes at a price that may be higher than you anticipate. He extended his hand, palm up, a silent invitation. Isolde hesitated for only a moment, then placed her hand in his. His grip was strong, firm, his skin warm against hers. It was a pact sealed, not in ink, but in the unspoken understanding between them, a pact forged in desperation and sealed with a dangerous promise. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, a feeling she quickly pushed aside, focusing on the task that lay before her. Edric's face and her freedom were her only concern. Chapter 3. Whispers in the stone halls. The silence that followed the sealing of their pact was thick with unspoken tension. Isolde withdrew her hand, the lingering warmth of his touch a stark reminder of the precariousness of her situation. She was bound to this man, this mercenary knight, by a desperate agreement, and the weight of it settled heavily upon her shoulders. Aldrich turned away, breaking the intensity of the moment, and moved back towards the fire. He gestured to a chair near the hearth. Sit, my lady. We have much to discuss. Isolde obeyed, grateful for the respite, however brief. The fire warmed her chilled skin, but it did little to ease the turmoil within her. She watched as Aldrich poured 2 goblets of wine from a silver pitcher, the liquid a deep, ruby red in the firelight. He offered her one, and she accepted it, her fingers brushing against his as she took the goblet. Another spark, another unwelcome shiver. Tell me everything, he said, settling into the chair opposite her. Tell me about your brother's capture, about Morian's strengths, about Evermere's defenses. Leave nothing out. And so she did. For the next hour, Isolde laid bare the situation, her voice steady and factual, even as her emotions churned beneath the surface. She described the ambush, the swiftness of Morian's attack, the overwhelming numbers of his forces. She spoke of Evermere's strengths and weaknesses, its loyal soldiers, its aging fortifications, its strategic location. She revealed the intelligence she had gathered about Morian, his ruthless ambition, his rumored alliances with neighboring lords, his history of broken treaties and treacherous betrayals. Aldrich listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He asked questions, sharp, insightful questions that probed deeper, revealing gaps in her knowledge, forcing her to confront the realities of the situation with a clarity she had previously avoided. He did not offer false reassurances or empty promises. He simply listened, assessed, and planned. As she spoke, Isolde began to see a different side of the mercenary knight. Beneath the hard exterior, the ruthless reputation, there was a keen intellect, a strategic mind that dissected the situation with a cold, calculating precision. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also a leader, a strategist, a man who understood the complexities of war far better than she did. Morian is not a fool, Aldrich said, when she had finished. He would not have risked such a bold move without securing his flanks. He has allies, powerful allies, who will support him if we attempt a direct assault. Isolde nodded, her heart sinking. I fear you are right. We are outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Not necessarily, Aldrich countered, a flicker of something that might have been a smile crossing his lips. War is not always about numbers. It is about strategy, about deception, about exploiting your enemy's weaknesses. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. We will not attack Evermere directly. That is what Morian expects. We will strike at his supply lines, disrupt his communications, sow discord among his allies. We will make him bleed, slowly, until he is forced to negotiate. Isolde listened, her initial despair giving way to a flicker of hope. His plan was bold, audacious, and risky, but it was also the only chance they had. She found herself trusting him, trusting his judgment, his experience, his unwavering confidence. And what of my brother? She asked, the question a whisper of fear that she could not entirely suppress. Morian will not hesitate to use him as a bargaining chip. Aldrich's expression softened, a subtle shift that surprised her. We will get your brother back, my lady, he said, his voice firm, reassuring. That is part of our pact. I do not break my oaths. His words, spoken with such conviction, eased the knot of anxiety in her chest. She believed him. She had to believe him. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, delving deeper into the details of their plan. Aldrich outlined his strategy, explaining his tactics, his methods, his expectations. He spoke of reconnaissance, of sabotage, of covert operations, of the need for secrecy and speed. He treated her as an equal, a partner in this endeavor, not merely a damsel in distress. The keep, initially so forbidding, began to feel less menacing. The whispers in the stone halls, the echoes of past battles, seemed to fade into the background as Isolde became engrossed in their conversation. She found herself drawn to Aldrich, to his strength, his intelligence, his unexpected gentleness. There were moments, fleeting moments, when their eyes met across the fire, when she felt a connection, a spark of something that transcended their circumstances. It was late when Aldrich finally rose from his chair. You must be weary, my lady, he said. My men will prepare a chamber for you. We leave at dawn. Isolde nodded, exhaustion settling upon her like a heavy cloak. She had not realized how drained she was, both physically and emotionally. He led her through the winding corridors of the keep, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The air was cold, damp, and the shadows danced with the flickering light of the torches that lined the walls. They reached a heavy oak door, and Aldrich pushed it open, revealing a small but comfortable chamber. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the simple furnishings. A bed, covered with thick furs, stood against one wall, and a small table and chair were placed near the window. It was a stark contrast to the opulent chambers of Evermere, but it felt safe, secure. Rest well, Lady Isolde, Aldrich said, his voice low, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. We have a long journey ahead of us. He turned to leave, but then paused, his hand on the doorframe. And, my lady, he added, his voice barely a whisper, do not doubt that I mean to keep my word. Your brother will be home." He left then, closing the door behind him, leaving Isolde alone with her thoughts. She stood for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his words echoing in her mind. His promise, his unwavering confidence, gave her a measure of peace she had not thought possible. She sank into a deep slumber as soon as her head touched the pillow. A noise awakened her and sat up straight. Where was she? She could hear the sound of armor and the distant voices of men preparing for something. She quickly remembered the pact. Edric. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Crown. The gray light of dawn filtered through the narrow window of the chamber, painting the stone walls in shades of muted silver. Isolde rose, stiff and sore from a night spent in an unfamiliar bed, but her mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead. She dressed quickly in the riding clothes she had worn the previous day. The familiar feel of the leather and wool a small comfort in this strange and unsettling place. A servant, a young woman with downcast eyes and a silent demeanor, brought her a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and ale. Isolde ate sparingly, her appetite subdued by the weight of her responsibilities and the uncertainty of the journey ahead. She had slept surprisingly well, considering the circumstances, but the brief respite had done little to ease the underlying anxiety that gnawed at her. As she finished her meal, a knock on the door announced Aldric's arrival. He entered the chamber, his presence filling the small space, making it seem even smaller. He was dressed for travel, his dark tunic replaced by a suit of chainmail, the links gleaming dully in the dim light. He wore his sword belt, and a heavy cloak was draped over his shoulders, fastened with a simple, unadorned clasp. "Are you ready, my lady?" he asked, his voice brisk, businesslike. Isolde nodded, rising to her feet. "As ready as I can be." He led her through the keep, the corridors now bustling with activity. Men at arms, clad in leather and steel, moved with purposeful strides, their faces grim, their weapons at the ready. The air was thick with a scent of anticipation, the tension of impending action. Isolde felt a surge of both fear and determination. She was stepping into a world of war, a world of danger and uncertainty, but she was not alone. She had Aldric and his seasoned warriors at her side. They emerged into the courtyard, where a small company of mounted soldiers awaited them. Phelan, her mare, was saddled and ready, her breath clouding in the cold morning air. Isolde mounted, feeling a sense of familiarity and comfort as she settled into the saddle. Aldric swung himself onto his own warhorse, a powerful black stallion that dwarfed Phelan. He surveyed his men, his gaze sharp and assessing. "We ride for Evermere," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "But we ride in silence. No fires, no unnecessary noise. We are shadows, ghosts, unseen and unheard." He turned to Isolde, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay close to me, my lady, and trust no one but my men." She nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she had made her choice. She had placed her trust in this mercenary knight, and she would follow him, wherever he led. They rode out of the keep, the gates closing behind them with a resounding thud that echoed the finality of their departure. The landscape was bleak and unforgiving, the rolling hills covered in a blanket of mist that clung to the ground, obscuring the path ahead. The air was cold, damp, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a raven. Isolde rode beside Aldric, her senses on high alert. She scanned the surrounding landscape, searching for any sign of danger, any hint of ambush. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, the knowledge that her brother's life and the fate of Evermere rested on her shoulders. She thought of her father, the late Lord of Evermere, a man of strength and wisdom who had taught her the importance of duty, of loyalty, of protecting her people. He had prepared her for this role, for the burdens of leadership, but he could not have foreseen the circumstances she now faced. She thought of Edric, her twin, her closest confidant, the one person who understood her better than anyone else. She pictured his smile, his laughter, his unwavering optimism, and the thought of him suffering in Morian's dungeons fueled her determination. As they rode, Isolde began to feel the weight of her crown, the invisible burden of leadership that she had inherited upon her father's death. It was a weight that had always been present, but it had never felt so heavy, so crushing, as it did now. She was not just a sister seeking to rescue her brother. She was a lady, a ruler, responsible for the well-being of her people, for the safety of her lands. She glanced at Aldrich, riding silently beside her, his face set, his eyes focused on the path ahead. He carried his own burdens, she knew, the weight of his past, the scars of countless battles, the responsibility for the lives of his men. Yet, he seemed to bear it all with an unwavering strength, a quiet confidence that she envied. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. The rumors spoke of a lost love, a betrayal, a self-imposed exile from his own lands. She sensed a deep sadness beneath his hard exterior, a hidden vulnerability that he guarded closely. She wanted to ask him about it and find out about the man who had offered to save her only brother. The mist began to dissipate, revealing the rugged beauty of the landscape. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, cast long shadows across the rolling hills. The air grew warmer, and the silence was broken by the songs of birds, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. But the beauty of the day could not entirely dispel the tension that hung in the air. They were riding into danger, into the unknown, and the fate of Evermere, and of those she held dear, hung precariously in the balance. Her duty was clear. Chapter 5. Beneath a Cloak of Stars. The first day's ride was grueling, a relentless push through rough terrain, testing the endurance of both riders and horses. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their focus on the path ahead. Isolde, accustomed to the comforts of Evermere, found herself struggling to keep pace with the seasoned warriors, but she refused to complain, determined to prove her strength, her resilience, to Aldrich and his men. As dusk began to settle, they reached a secluded copse of trees, nestled in a hollow between two rolling hills. Aldrich signaled a halt, and the weary company dismounted, grateful for the respite. "We make camp here for the night," he announced, his voice low, but carrying clearly to his men. 2 men on watch, at all times. No fires, unless absolutely necessary. The men set about their tasks with practiced efficiency, unsaddling their horses, setting up a perimeter, preparing a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. Isolde watched them, admiring their discipline, their quiet competence. She felt a sense of gratitude for their presence, for their willingness to risk their lives for her cause. Aldrich approached her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "You have held up well, my lady," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "This is not a journey for the faint of heart." Isolde straightened her shoulders, pushing back the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm her. "I am not faint of heart, Sir Aldrich," she replied, her voice firm. "I am determined to reach my brother, whatever it takes." He nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "I see that," he murmured. "But even the strongest need rest. Eat and try to sleep. We ride again at dawn." He offered her a portion of the dried meat, and she accepted it, grateful for his consideration. They ate in silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the occasional whinny of a horse. As darkness deepened, the stars began to emerge, a breathtaking display of celestial beauty that stretched across the vast expanse of the night sky. Isolde gazed upwards, finding a momentary solace in the timeless spectacle. She had always loved the stars, their silent, distant presence, a reminder of the vastness of the universe, the insignificance of earthly concerns. Aldrich, she noticed, was also looking at the stars, his silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. He seemed lost in thought, his expression contemplative, a hint of melancholy in his eyes. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He turned to her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Miss what, my lady?" "The sky," she said, gesturing upwards. "The freedom of the open road. The life of a mercenary." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent an unexpected shiver through her. "Freedom is a fleeting illusion, my lady," he said. "We are all bound by something, whether it be duty, loyalty, or the chains of our own past." He paused, his gaze returning to the stars. "But yes," he admitted, his voice softer now, almost wistful. "There are times when I miss the simplicity of it. The camaraderie of the road, the challenge of survival, the absence of complications." Isolde sensed a hidden meaning in his words, a hint of regret, of longing for a life he could no longer have. She wondered what those complications were, what burdens he carried, what secrets he kept hidden beneath his hard exterior. "What made you choose this life?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "It chose me, my lady," he replied, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. "Circumstances, betrayal, a broken oath, it is a long story, and not one for a night like this." He looked away, dismissing the subject, but Isolde's curiosity was piqued. She wanted to know more, to understand the man behind the mask, the warrior beneath the armor. "Tell me," she said, her voice firm, insistent. "I want to know." He hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and the starry sky. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether to trust her with his secrets. Finally, he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Very well, my lady," he said. "But know this, my past is not a pretty tale. It is filled with shadows, with loss, with regrets." He began to speak, his voice low, his words measured, as if he were unearthing memories long buried, emotions long suppressed. He spoke of his youth, of his noble upbringing, of his betrothal to a woman he loved, a woman who had been taken from him by a treacherous rival. He spoke of his vow of vengeance, of his self-imposed exile, of his years spent wandering the land, selling his sword to the highest bidder, seeking to numb the pain, to escape the ghosts of his past. Isolde listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his loss, his sense of betrayal. She, too, had known loss, the sudden death of her father, the constant threat to her lands, the burden of responsibility that weighed heavily upon her. As he spoke, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the barriers of rank and circumstance fading away. They were simply two souls, sharing their sorrows, their vulnerabilities, beneath the vast, indifferent cloak of stars. He fell silent, his story unfinished, but Isolde understood. She understood the pain that drove him, the demons that haunted him, the loneliness that he tried to conceal. "I am sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. "For your loss, for your pain." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. "Thank you, my lady," he murmured. "It has been a long time since anyone has offered me such kindness." A silence fell between them, a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding. They gazed at each other, the starlight illuminating their faces, revealing the emotions that flickered in their eyes. It had grown cold. Aldrich removed his heavy cloak and moved to place it on her shoulders. Isolde met his eyes. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The warmth of Aldrich's cloak enveloped Isolde, a comforting weight against the chill night air. The scent of him clung to the fabric, a blend of leather, steel, and something uniquely his own, a scent that stirred a strange, unfamiliar feeling within her. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his in the dim light, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in the stillness of the night. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. He did not step away, but remained close, his presence a tangible force, a source of both comfort and unease. "You should rest," he said, his voice low, husky. "We have a long day ahead of us." Isolde nodded, but she made no move to leave. She was reluctant to break the spell, to return to the reality of their situation, to the dangers that awaited them. She wanted to stay there, in the circle of his warmth, beneath the watchful gaze of the stars, and explore this unexpected connection that had sprung between them. "Will you stay?" she asked, the question surprising even herself. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and the surrounding darkness. I should keep watch, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Your men are capable, she replied, her voice soft, persuasive. And I would feel safer with you here. It was a lie, and yet it was also the truth. She did feel safer with him, protected, not just physically, but emotionally. His presence calmed her fears, eased her anxieties, and offered a sense of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her motives, to understand the unspoken emotions that flickered beneath the surface. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Very well, my lady, he said. I will stay. He settled down beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They sat in silence for a while, gazing up at the stars, the vast expanse of the night sky a silent witness to their unspoken connection. You said your betrothed was taken from you, Isolde said, breaking the silence, her voice hesitant. What happened? He sighed, a deep, weary sound. It was a long time ago, he said. A lifetime ago. But you still remember, she said, her voice soft, understanding. He nodded. Some wounds never fully heal, he murmured. They leave scars, reminders of what was lost, what could have been. He began to speak, his voice low, his words measured, as if he were reliving the events as he recounted them. He told her of Alara, his betrothed, a woman of beauty, grace, and spirit, a woman he had loved with all his heart. He spoke of their courtship, their plans for the future, their dreams of a life together. He then told her of Lord Kilian, a powerful and ambitious nobleman who had coveted Alara for himself. Kilian had challenged Aldrich to a duel that Aldrich had won, fairly and honorably. But Kilian, unwilling to accept defeat, had resorted to treachery. He had ambushed Aldrich, aided by his men, and had taken Alara captive. Aldrich had pursued them, desperate to rescue her, but he had been too late. He had found Alara dead, murdered by Kilian's men. His world had shattered, his heart broken beyond repair. He had sworn vengeance, and he had pursued Kilian relentlessly, driven by grief and rage. He had finally cornered him, and they had fought a final, desperate battle. Aldrich had killed Kilian, but the victory had been hollow, empty. It could not bring Alara back. He had renounced his title, his lands, his inheritance, and had become a mercenary, a wanderer, seeking to escape the ghosts of his past, to numb the pain of his loss. Isolde listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his grief, his rage, his sense of loss. She, too, had known the pain of losing someone she loved, the sudden death of her father, the constant threat to her brother. I am so sorry, she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. I cannot imagine the pain you must have endured. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. Thank you, my lady, he murmured. It is strange to speak of it after so long. I have kept it buried, locked away. Sometimes it helps to share the burden, she said, her voice soft. To know that you are not alone. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. Perhaps you are right, he said. And perhaps I have found someone I can finally trust. His words, spoken with such sincerity, sent a warmth through her, a feeling of connection that transcended their circumstances. She reached out, her hand finding his, her fingers intertwining with his. His grip was strong, firm, his skin warm against hers. They sat there, hand in hand, beneath the cloak of stars, their silence filled with unspoken emotions. The shadows of the past still lingered, but for the first time, Aldrich felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. And Isolde, facing the daunting task ahead, found a measure of strength and comfort in the presence of this complex, wounded man. The fear was still there, but a new feeling bloomed as well. Chapter 7. The Lion and the Rose. The journey to Evermere continued, each day bringing them closer to their destination and closer to the inevitable confrontation with Morian. The landscape changed, the rugged hills giving way to rolling meadows and dense forests, the familiar sights of her homeland stirring a mixture of hope and apprehension within Isolde. She and Aldrich rode side by side, their conversations growing longer, deeper, more intimate. They spoke of their hopes, their fears, their dreams, their pasts. Isolde learned more about Aldrich's life as a mercenary, the battles he had fought, the men he had led, the code of honor he adhered to, despite the often brutal nature of his profession. Aldrich, in turn, learned more about Isolde's life as a lady, the responsibilities she carried, the challenges she faced, the loneliness she often felt, despite being surrounded by people. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering determination to protect her people, and he admired her for it. He found the walls around his heart weakening. The bond between them deepened, forged in shared experiences, mutual respect, and a growing attraction that neither of them could deny. The subtle touches, the lingering glances, the unspoken words, all spoke of a connection that transcended their circumstances, a spark that had ignited beneath the cloak of stars and continued to burn brighter with each passing day. One evening, as they camped near a clear, fast-flowing stream, Aldrich brought Isolde a small, delicate wildflower, a single, perfect bloom of vibrant blue. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. "It reminded me of your eyes," he said, his voice low, husky, his gaze meeting hers. Isolde accepted the flower, her fingers brushing against his, sending a shiver through her. She held the bloom to her nose, inhaling its sweet fragrance. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "It is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you, my lady," he said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rushing water. His words, spoken with such sincerity, took her breath away. She looked up at him, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own feelings, a mixture of desire, longing, and a hint of fear. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was warm, tender, sending a wave of heat through her. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the moment, the intimacy, the connection. "Isolde," he whispered, her name a breath on her lips. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, her heart overflowing with emotion. She saw in his eyes a question, a plea, an invitation. She knew she should resist, that this was dangerous, forbidden, that it could complicate everything. But she could not deny the feelings that surged within her, the longing for his touch, his kiss, his embrace. She had spent many a lonely night, wondering if her heart could still feel. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, a slow, tender exploration, a release of pent-up emotions, a merging of two souls. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a connection that had been forged in the crucible of danger and uncertainty. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, that bound them together in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, bathed in the soft glow of the twilight. "Aldrich," she whispered, her voice trembling. He silenced her with another kiss, a kiss that was more passionate, more demanding, a kiss that spoke of a love that had blossomed in the shadows, a love that defied the odds, a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. The sounds of the camp and the rushing stream seemed miles away. "My lady," he breathed the words on her lips. Isolde found herself torn. The symbol of her house was the falcon, swift and soaring. But Aldrich, with his strength and surprising tenderness, made her think of a lion. And she, with her title, her family, was like a rare and carefully cultivated rose. A lion and a rose. An unlikely pairing, but one, she reflected, she suddenly wished to make real. The dangers facing them seemed to melt away in the growing darkness. Chapter 8. A Dance of Blades and Secrets. The days that followed were filled with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The kiss, the shared moment of intimacy, had changed everything. It had broken down the barriers between them, revealing the depth of their feelings, but it had also raised the stakes, complicating their mission, blurring the lines between duty and desire. They continued to ride towards Evermere, their conversations now laced with a new awareness, a subtle undercurrent of longing and anticipation. They stole glances, shared brief touches, whispered words of affection, all the while aware of the watchful eyes of Aldrich's men and the ever-present threat of Morian's forces. One afternoon, as they were scouting ahead, they stumbled upon a small patrol of Morian soldiers. The encounter was sudden, unexpected, and unavoidable. "Stay behind me," Aldrich ordered, his voice sharp, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. Isolde obeyed, her heart pounding, her hand gripping the hilt of the small dagger she carried at her waist. She had never been in a battle before, and the prospect terrified her, but she was determined to stand her ground, to fight alongside Aldrich, to defend her lands, her people. The skirmish was brief, but brutal. Aldrich, a whirlwind of steel and fury, dispatched the enemy soldiers with a ruthless efficiency that both awed and frightened Isolde. He moved with a grace and precision that belied his size, his sword a blur of motion, his eyes cold, focused, deadly. She watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. She saw the warrior, the killer, the man who had spent his life in battle, the man who had taken a life to avenge his lost love. But she also saw the man who had offered her kindness, compassion, and a love that she had never expected to find. When the last of the enemy soldiers had fallen, Aldrich turned to her, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and blood. He searched her eyes, his gaze filled with concern. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice rough, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Isolde nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes," she whispered. "I am fine." He reached out, his hand gently wiping a smudge of blood from her cheek. His touch was tender, reassuring, a stark contrast to the violence that had just transpired. "You were brave," he said, his voice softer now. "You did not flinch." "I was terrified," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a faint, weary smile that warmed her heart. "Fear is a natural response," he said. "It is what you do in the face of fear that matters." He sheathed his sword, the metallic clang echoing in the sudden silence. He looked at the fallen soldiers, his expression grim. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Morian will not let this go unpunished. He will send more men, stronger forces." Isolde nodded, her heart sinking. She knew he was right. The skirmish had been a victory, but it was also a warning, a prelude to the larger battle that lay ahead. They returned to camp, the news of the encounter spreading quickly among Aldrich's men. They treated Isolde with a newfound respect, their eyes acknowledging her courage, her willingness to stand and fight. That night, as they sat by the fire, Aldrich spoke of his plan to infiltrate Evermere, to gather intelligence, to assess Morian's defenses, to prepare for the final assault. "I will go alone," he said, his voice firm, decisive. "It is too dangerous for you to accompany me." Isolde protested, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I am not afraid," she said. "I want to help." He shook his head. "It is not a matter of courage, my lady," he said. "It is a matter of strategy. You are more valuable to me alive and safe. I need you to rally your people, to prepare them for the battle to come." She knew he was right, but she hated the thought of being separated from him, of not knowing what was happening, of feeling helpless and vulnerable. "Promise me you will be careful," she said, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his grip firm, reassuring. "I promise," he said, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "I will return to you." His words, spoken with such conviction, eased her fears, but they also stirred a longing within her, a desire for a future that she knew was uncertain, precarious. A future together. They shared a kiss, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of their love, their commitment, their shared hope for a future that might never be. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that would sustain them through the darkness that lay ahead. Secrets are a tricky thing, she thought. She had been keeping her growing feelings a secret from Aldrich's men, and perhaps even from herself. But now, with this skirmish and his plan, she knew she could not keep her feelings hidden for long. Everything had changed. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Kiss. Aldrich slipped away in the dead of night, a shadow among shadows, leaving Isolde with a heavy heart and a gnawing sense of unease. She watched him go, her eyes straining to follow his silhouette until it disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with her fears and her anxieties. She spent the next few days in a state of restless anticipation, pacing the confines of the camp, her mind racing with possibilities, both good and bad. She drilled with Aldrich's men, honing her skills with the dagger, learning the basics of sword fighting, preparing herself for the inevitable battle. She found a strange comfort in the physical exertion, the discipline, the camaraderie of the soldiers. She also spent time studying the maps of Evermere, memorizing the layout of the castle, the surrounding terrain, the strategic locations that Aldrich had identified. She tried to focus on the task at hand, to push aside her fears for Aldrich's safety, but her thoughts kept returning to him, to his strength, his courage, his tenderness. One evening, as she was sitting alone by the fire, lost in thought, a messenger arrived from Evermere. He was one of her own men, a loyal soldier who had managed to slip through Morian's lines. He brought news, grim news. "My lady," he said, his voice breathless, his face pale with exhaustion. "Lord Morian has tightened his grip on the castle. He has increased his patrols, fortified his defenses. He suspects an attack." Isolde's heart sank. She knew that Aldrich's mission had become even more dangerous. "And my brother?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is there any news of Edric?" The messenger hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "He is alive, my lady," he said. "But he is being held in the deepest dungeon, under heavy guard. Morian is using him as leverage, a threat to keep your people in line." Isolde felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had hoped that Edric would be safe, that Morian would not dare to harm him. But she had underestimated his cruelty, his ruthlessness. "There is more, my lady," the messenger continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are whispers of a betrayal. Someone within Evermere is working with Morian, feeding him information, aiding his cause." Isolde's blood ran cold. A traitor. Someone within her own ranks, someone she trusted, was working against her brother, against Evermere. "Who?" she asked, her voice sharp, her eyes narrowed. "Who is the traitor?" The messenger shook his head. "I do not know, my lady," he said. "The rumors are vague, unsubstantiated, but they are persistent, and they are spreading fear and distrust among your people." Isolde felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, of frustration. She had to find the traitor, to expose them, to stop them before they could do any more damage. But how? How could she identify someone who was hidden among her own people, someone who wore a mask of loyalty while plotting her downfall? The messenger left, returning to Evermere, carrying Isolde's instructions to rally her loyal forces, to prepare for the coming battle. She was left alone with her thoughts, her fears, her suspicions. She paced the confines of the camp, her mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle, to identify the traitor. She reviewed every conversation, every encounter, every interaction she had had with her people, searching for any clue, any hint of betrayal. Her thoughts kept returning to one person, Lady Alara, a childhood friend, a distant cousin, a woman she had always trusted, a woman who had been close to her father and now served as her advisor. Alara had always been ambitious, eager for power, and she had never fully approved of Isolde's ascension to the lordship of Evermere. Could she be the traitor? The thought was painful, unbearable. Alara had been like a sister to her, a confidant, a friend. But the rumors, the whispers, the messenger's words, all pointed in her direction. Isolde decided to test her, to set a trap, to see if she could expose her treachery. She summoned Alara to her tent, under the guise of seeking her advice on a matter of strategy. Alara arrived, her face composed, her eyes guarded. She greeted Isolde with a smile, a hug, a display of affection that felt hollow, false. "My dear Isolde," she said, her voice smooth, soothing. "How can I help you?" Isolde forced herself to smile, to return the embrace, to play the role of the trusting friend. "I am troubled, Alara," she said. "I have received reports of increased enemy activity near the northern border. I fear an attack." She watched Alara closely, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of guilt. Alara's expression did not change. Her eyes remained calm, her voice steady. "That is concerning, my lady," she said. "But I am sure our defenses are strong enough to withstand any assault." "Perhaps," Isolde said. "But I would feel better if we sent a patrol to scout the area, to assess the situation." She outlined a plan, a false plan, designed to lure the traitor into revealing themselves. She suggested sending a small patrol to a specific location, a location that was vulnerable, exposed, an easy target for an ambush. Alara listened intently, nodding her head, offering suggestions, playing the role of the loyal advisor. She agreed with the plan wholeheartedly, without any hesitation. Isolde's heart sank. Alara's eagerness, her lack of caution, her willingness to send a patrol into a potentially dangerous situation, all confirmed her suspicions. Alara had been subtly pressing for more aggressive actions for the past few days. It was a serpent's kiss, a friend, seemingly offering good advice, that only led to disaster. "Thank you, Alara," Isolde said, her voice tight, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Your advice is always valuable." Alara smiled, a triumphant smile that sent a chill down Isolde's spine. "I am always happy to serve you, my lady," she said. Alara left, and Isolde was left alone with her grief, her rage, her sense of betrayal. The friend she had trusted, the woman she had considered a sister, had betrayed her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a wound that cut deep. But she knew she could not let her emotions control her. She had to act, to stop Alara, to protect her people, to save her brother. The pain would have to wait. Chapter 10. Across a Sea of Swords. The revelation of Alara's treachery solidified Isolde's resolve. Grief and anger warred within her, but duty won out. She could not afford to wallow in her personal pain. Edric's life, and the fate of Evermere, hung in the balance. She spent the remaining hours before dawn formulating a plan, a counter-strategy to neutralize Alara's betrayal and prepare for Aldric's return. She knew that time was of the essence. If Alara had been feeding information to Morian, then Aldric was walking into a trap. Just as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. It could be Aldric returning safely, or it could be Morian's forces, alerted to their presence by Alara. She emerged from her tent, her hand on the hilt of her dagger, her eyes scanning the horizon. It was Aldric, riding hard, his face grim, his clothes stained with dirt and blood. He was alone. He dismounted, his movements stiff and weary. He looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with an intensity that sent a shiver through Isolde. "Isolde," he said, his voice rough, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have a problem." She rushed to him, her hands reaching out to steady him. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "I am fine," he said. "But Morian knows we are here. He has strengthened his defenses, increased his patrols. He is expecting an attack." Isolde's heart sank. Alara's betrayal had been swift and effective. "There is a traitor," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Someone within Evermere is working with Morian." Aldric's eyes narrowed. "Who?" he asked. "Alara," Isolde said, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. "My friend, my advisor, a serpent in my bosom." Aldric's expression hardened. He had warned her about trusting those within the castle. He cursed softly, his hand clenching into a fist. "We need to act quickly," he said. "Morian will be expecting a direct assault. We need to change our strategy. They spent the next few hours huddled together, revising their plans, adapting to the new circumstances. Aldrich, despite his exhaustion, was sharp, focused, his strategic mind working tirelessly to find a way to overcome the obstacles that lay before them. He proposed a daring plan, a risky maneuver that relied on deception, speed, and surprise. They would divide their forces, creating a diversion to draw Morian's attention away from the main attack. A small, elite team, led by Aldrich, would infiltrate the castle through a secret passage, a passage known only to a handful of people, a passage that Isolde had revealed to him. "It is dangerous," Isolde said, her voice filled with concern. "The passage is narrow, treacherous, and heavily guarded." "It is our only chance," Aldrich replied, his voice firm. "We have to take the risk." She knew he was right. They had no other choice. They had to fight, to save Edric, to liberate Evermere. The plan was set in motion. The diversionary force, led by one of Aldrich's most trusted lieutenants, rode out, making a show of force, drawing Morian's attention to the north. Meanwhile, Aldrich, Isolde, and a small hand-picked team of warriors prepared to infiltrate the castle. Isolde, armed with her dagger and a newfound determination, stood beside Aldrich, ready to face whatever lay ahead. She had shed her fear, her doubts, her insecurities. She was a lady, a warrior, a leader, and she would fight for her people, for her brother, for her love. They entered the secret passage, a narrow, dark, and claustrophobic tunnel that wound its way beneath the castle walls. The air was cold, damp, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and their ragged breaths. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Isolde felt a sense of dread, a premonition of danger. She knew that they were walking into a trap, that Morian was waiting for them, that the battle ahead would be fierce and bloody. They crept forward slowly. Suddenly, a shout rang out, followed by the clang of steel on steel. The trap had been sprung. Morian soldiers, alerted by Ilara, were waiting for them. "For Evermere," Aldrich roared, his voice echoing through the narrow passage. He drew his sword, a flash of silver in the darkness, and charged into the fray. Isolde followed, her heart pounding, her dagger drawn. She fought with a ferocity she had never known she possessed, driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and love. She fought for Edric, for Evermere, for Aldrich. The passage became a scene of chaos, a whirlwind of steel and blood. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, the clash of swords. Isolde fought bravely, skillfully, using the techniques she had learned from Aldrich's men. She defended herself, protected her companions, and struck down her enemies. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in a nightmare, a dream that made little sense. She saw Aldrich, a figure of strength and fury, cutting a swathe through the enemy ranks. He was a force of nature, a warrior born, a leader of men. He fought with a skill and determination that inspired her, that gave her hope. But even Aldrich could not be everywhere at once. The enemy soldiers were numerous, well-armed and determined. They pressed their attack, forcing Isolde and her companions back, inch by inch. The sea of swords felt endless. The outcome uncertain. Chapter 11. The Chains of Duty. The fighting in the narrow confines of the passage was brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Isolde fought with a courage she didn't know she possessed, her small dagger a surprisingly effective weapon against the heavier swords of Morian soldiers. She moved with a fluidity born of desperation, dodging blows, parrying attacks, and striking whenever an opportunity presented itself. But the enemy soldiers were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. They pressed their attack, forcing Isolde and her companions back, inch by inch, towards the entrance of the passage. She saw Aldrich, his face grim, his sword dripping with blood, fighting with a ferocity that both awed and terrified her. He was a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down enemy soldiers with a ruthless efficiency, but even he seemed overwhelmed by the sheer number of opponents. Suddenly, a cry rang out, a cry of pain and despair. Isolde's heart leaped into her throat. She saw one of Aldrich's men fall, a sword thrust through his chest. Then another and another. The tide of the battle was turning against them. "We have to retreat," she shouted to Aldrich, her voice hoarse with desperation. "We cannot win this fight." Aldrich hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his face torn between his duty to rescue Edric and his responsibility for the lives of his men. He knew that Isolde was right. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and trapped in a deadly bottleneck. "Fall back," he roared, his voice echoing through the passage. "Fall back to the entrance." The remaining soldiers, battered and bruised, began to retreat, fighting a desperate rearguard action. Isolde found herself pressed against Aldrich's back, his body shielding her from the enemy blows. She felt his strength, his warmth, his unwavering determination, and it gave her the courage to keep fighting. They reached the entrance of the passage, stumbling out into the open air, blinking in the sudden brightness. They were met by a scene of chaos. Morian's forces had surrounded the area, cutting off their escape. Isolde looked at Aldrich, her eyes filled with despair. "We are trapped," she whispered. He nodded, his face grim.
"It seems so," he said.
"But we are not defeated. We will fight to the last." He raised a sword, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. "For Evermere," he shouted. "For freedom." His men rallied around him, their spirits lifted by his courage, his defiance. They formed a tight circle, their backs to each other, their swords raised, ready to face the inevitable. Isolde stood beside Aldrich, her dagger drawn, her heart pounding. She knew that this might be their last stand, that they might die here, beneath the walls of Evermere. But she was not afraid. She was with Aldrich, and that was all that mattered. The enemy soldiers charged, a wave of steel and fury. The battle was joined, a desperate clash of arms, a whirlwind of violence and death. Isolde fought with a ferocity born of desperation, her small dagger a blur of motion. She parried blows, dodged attacks, and struck whenever she could. She saw Aldrich, his sword a silver streak in the sunlight, cutting down enemy soldiers with a ruthless efficiency. But the enemy soldiers were too numerous, too strong. They overwhelmed Isolde and her companions, driving them back, inch by inch. One by one, Aldrich's men fell, their bodies littering the ground. Isolde found herself surrounded, separated from Aldrich, facing a ring of enemy soldiers. She fought bravely, desperately, but she knew it was hopeless. She was exhausted, wounded, and outnumbered. A soldier lunged at her, his sword raised, ready to strike the killing blow. Isolde closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact. But the blow never came. She heard a roar, a cry of rage, and then a thud. She opened her eyes and saw Aldrich standing over her, his sword dripping with blood, his face contorted with fury. He had saved her life, again. But he was wounded, badly wounded. A sword thrust had pierced his armor, and blood was flowing freely from the wound. He staggered, his knees buckling, and he fell to the ground. "Aldrich!" Isolde screamed, rushing to his side. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with love. "Isolde," he whispered, his voice weak. I am sorry." "Don't speak," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Save your strength." He shook his head. "It is too late," he said. "But I have no regrets. I love you." His eyes closed, and his body went limp. He was gone. Isolde screamed, a cry of anguish, of despair, of loss. She had lost everything. Her brother, her home, her love. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, facing certain death. But even in her grief, she felt a flicker of defiance, a spark of anger. She would not surrender. She would not let Aldrich's sacrifice be in vain. She rose to her feet, her hands still covered in Aldrich's blood. She picked up his sword, the heavy blade feeling strange and unfamiliar in her grasp. She raised it high, her voice ringing out across the battlefield. For Evermere, she shouted. For Aldrich. She charged into the enemy ranks, a lone figure of defiance, a warrior queen, fighting for her lost love, for her lost home, for her lost freedom. She fought with a fury born of grief, a rage born of loss. She had a debt to repay. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Chapel. Isolde fought like a woman possessed, fueled by grief and a desperate need for vengeance. Aldrich's sword, though heavy and unwieldy in her hands, became an extension of her will, a tool of destruction. She cut down enemy soldiers with a ferocity that surprised even herself, her movements driven by instinct and a raw, primal rage. But the enemy soldiers were too numerous, too strong. They surrounded her, their swords pressing in, their faces grim and determined. She knew she could not win, that this was the end. But she would not surrender. She would fight to her last breath, honoring Aldrich's memory, avenging his death. Suddenly, a horn blew, a loud, clear blast that echoed across the battlefield. The enemy soldiers hesitated, their attack faltering. Isolde looked up, her heart pounding, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. From the gates of Evermere, a small force of soldiers emerged, riding hard, their banners flying high. They were her own men, the loyal soldiers who had remained within the castle, waiting for her signal. They had seen the battle, seen Aldrich fall, and they had come to her aid. Leading the charge was a familiar figure, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grim face and a determined gaze. It was Edric, her brother, freed from his prison by a handful of loyal men who had remained true to their oath. Isolde's heart leaped with a mixture of joy and relief. She was not alone. Her brother was alive, and her people had not abandoned her. The arrival of the fresh troops turned the tide of the battle. The enemy soldiers, surprised and outnumbered, began to falter. Isolde, renewed by a surge of hope, fought with even greater ferocity, her sword a blur of motion. Edric reached her side, his face streaked with sweat and blood. "Isolde," he shouted, his voice filled with relief. "Are you all right?" "I am now," she replied, her voice hoarse but strong. "We have to win this, Edric. For Aldrich." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination. He had seen Aldrich fall, and he knew the price of their victory. Together, Isolde and Edric rallied their forces, driving back the enemy soldiers, pushing them away from the walls of Evermere. The battle raged, a fierce and bloody struggle, but the momentum had shifted. Isolde's forces, inspired by her courage and Edric's leadership, fought with a renewed determination, their hearts filled with a thirst for vengeance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the enemy soldiers broke and fled, their retreat turning into a rout. The battle was won, but the victory was bittersweet. Isolde stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the dead and the dying, her body aching, her heart heavy with grief. She had won, but she had lost so much. Edric approached her, his face somber, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Isolde," he said softly,
"I am so sorry about Aldrich."
He was a brave man, a true hero. Isolde nodded, her tears streaming down her face. She whispered. "He saved my life. He saved Evermere." They stood in silence for a moment, honoring Aldrich's memory, mourning his loss. Then, Edric led Isolde back into the castle, into the familiar halls of her ancestral home. The castle was in disarray, the signs of the recent occupation evident everywhere. But it was still Evermere, still her home. Isolde walked through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She felt a sense of emptiness, of loss, that was almost unbearable. Aldrich was gone, and a part of her had gone with him. She found herself drawn to the castle chapel, a small, quiet sanctuary where she had often sought solace in the past. She entered the chapel, the air cool and still, the scent of incense lingering in the air. She knelt before the altar, her body aching, her heart heavy with grief. She closed her eyes and prayed. She prayed for Aldrich, for his soul, for his peace. She prayed for Edric, for his safety, for his strength. She prayed for Evermere, for its people, for its future. As she prayed, she felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace that she had not expected. She felt Aldrich's presence, his spirit, his love, surrounding her, comforting her, guiding her. She opened her eyes and saw a single ray of sunlight streaming through the stained glass window, illuminating the altar. It was a sign, she believed, a sign that Aldrich was with her, that he was watching over her, that he would always be a part of her. His spirit was there. She rose to her feet, her heart still heavy with grief, but also filled with a newfound determination. She would honor Aldrich's memory, she would rebuild Evermere, she would lead her people with strength and compassion. She would carry on his legacy, his fight for freedom, his love for her. She knew she had a long road to walk. She would never forget him. He had been a mercenary, a warrior, a knight. But to her, he had been so much more. He had been her love, her protector, her soulmate. And he would live on, in her heart, forever. She whispered a final prayer and stepped back into the castle. Chapter 13. A Knight's Confession. The days following the battle were a blur of activity. Isolde, despite her grief, threw herself into the task of rebuilding Evermere, restoring order, and tending to the wounded. She worked tirelessly, driven by a sense of duty and a need to keep busy, to avoid the overwhelming sorrow that threatened to consume her. Edric, too, was consumed by the responsibilities of leadership. He had to reorganize the defenses of the castle, replenish the depleted supplies, and deal with the aftermath of Morian's occupation. He also had to deal with the traitor, Alara. Isolde had ordered Alara's arrest, and she was now imprisoned in the castle dungeon, awaiting trial. Isolde had not yet spoken to her, unable to face the woman who had betrayed her so deeply. One evening, as Isolde was sitting alone in her chamber, exhausted and emotionally drained, Edric came to see her. He looked weary, his face etched with concern. "Isolde," he said softly, "we need to talk about Alara." Isolde nodded, her heart heavy. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she had been dreading it. "I cannot bring myself to speak to her," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The thought of her betrayal, it is too painful." Edric sat beside her, his hand gently taking hers. "I understand," he said, "but we need to know why she did it. We need to understand her motives, her plans." "And then what?" Isolde asked, her voice bitter. "What punishment is fitting for such treachery?" "That is for you to decide, my sister," Edric said. "You are the Lady of Evermere. You must dispense justice." Isolde sighed, her shoulders slumping. She knew he was right. She could not avoid her responsibilities, however painful they might be. "Very well," she said. "I will speak to her tomorrow." The next morning, Isolde descended into the dungeon, accompanied by Edric and a small guard. The air was cold, damp, and the silence was broken only by the dripping of water and the occasional moan from a prisoner. They reached Alara's cell, a small, dark, and dank chamber. Alara was sitting on a straw pallet, her face pale, her eyes downcast. She looked up as Isolde approached, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "Isolde," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Isolde stood before her, her face impassive, her heart a turmoil of conflicting emotions. She felt anger, betrayal, sadness, and a lingering sense of disbelief. "Why, Alara?" she asked, her voice cold and steady. "Why did you betray me? Why did you betray Evermere?" Alara hesitated, her eyes flickering between Isolde and Edric. I had no choice," she said. "Morian, he threatened me. He threatened my family." Isolde scoffed, her voice filled with disbelief. "That is a lie," she said. "You were always ambitious, Alara. You always coveted power. You saw an opportunity to seize control of Evermere, and you took it." Alara's eyes filled with tears. "That is not true," she said. I did it for you, Isolde. I did it to protect you." "Protect me?" Isolde asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "How did betraying me to Morian protect me?" Alara looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Morian he promised that if I cooperated, he would spare your life. He would make you his queen. He would unite Evermere and his own lands, creating a powerful kingdom. Isolde stared at her, stunned. "You believed him?" she asked. "You believed that Morian, a man known for his cruelty and treachery, would honor such a promise?" Alara nodded, her tears streaming down her face. I hoped," she said. "I thought it was the only way to save you, to save Evermere." Isolde felt a surge of anger, of disgust, of pity. Alara was either incredibly naive or incredibly foolish. Or perhaps she was simply desperate, willing to grasp at any straw to save herself. "You were wrong, Alara," Isolde said, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You betrayed your oaths, your loyalty, your friendship. You betrayed Evermere. And for what? For a lie, a false promise, a serpent's whisper." Alara began to sob, her body shaking with despair. "I am sorry, Isolde," she whispered. "Please forgive me." Isolde looked at her, her heart torn. She wanted to hate Alara, to condemn her, to punish her for her treachery. But she also felt a lingering sense of sadness, of pity, for the woman who had once been her friend. "I do not know if I can forgive you, Alara," she said. "Your betrayal has cost us dearly." It cost Aldrich his life. At the mention of Aldrich's name, Alara looked up, her eyes filled with a new horror. "Aldrich?" she whispered. "He is dead?" Isolde nodded, her tears falling freely now. "He died saving me," she said. "He died because of your treachery." Alara covered her face with her hands, her body racked with sobs. "No," she moaned. "No, I did not know. I did not want that." Isolde turned away, unable to bear the sight of Alara's grief. She had made her decision. "Alara," she said, her voice firm, "you will be banished from Evermere. You will never return. That is my judgment." She turned and walked away, leaving Alara alone in her cell, her sobs echoing in the darkness. As she walked back through the castle with her brother, Edric stopped her. In his things, in Aldrich's saddlebags, we found this." He reached into his tunic and brought out a sealed letter. The handwriting on the outside was strong and bold. "It's addressed to you," he said. Isolde took the letter and went to her solar. She sat at her desk and, with trembling fingers, opened the letter, penned in Aldrich's hand. It was a knight's confession, of a love he'd not dared to speak aloud fully, of a hope for a future he'd only begun to dream of. It ended, simply, with the words, "My heart is yours, Isolde. Always." Chapter 14. The Price of Freedom. Isolde sat in the quiet solitude of her solar, Aldrich's letter clutched in her trembling hand. The words swam before her eyes, blurring with the tears that streamed down her face. His confession, his declaration of love, his hope for a future that would never be, pierced her heart with a pain that was almost unbearable. She read the letter again and again, each word a testament to the depth of his feelings, a reminder of what she had lost. She traced the strong, bold strokes of his handwriting, feeling a phantom touch of his hand on hers, a ghostly whisper of his voice in her ear. The weight of his absence pressed down on her, a heavy burden of grief and regret. She had loved him, she realized, with a depth and intensity that she had never known possible. She had found in him a kindred spirit, a protector, a soulmate. And now, he was gone, stolen from her by the cruel hand of fate, by the treachery of a friend, by the endless cycle of violence and war. She closed her eyes, picturing his face, his smile, his intense blue eyes that had seen so much pain, so much loss, but had also held such tenderness, such hope. She remembered his touch, his warmth, his strength, the feeling of safety and security she had found in his embrace. She clutched the letter to her chest, her body shaking with sobs. She grieved for him, for their lost love, for the future they would never share. She grieved for Evermere, for its people, for the sacrifices they had made. But amidst her grief, she also felt a flicker of resolve, a spark of determination. She would not let Aldrich's death be in vain. She would honor his memory. She would carry on his legacy. She would rebuild Evermere, stronger and more resilient than before. She rose from her chair, her legs shaky, her heart heavy. She walked to the window, gazing out at the landscape below, the rolling hills, the dense forests, the familiar sights of her homeland. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the enduring beauty of the world, despite the pain and suffering that it held. It was a reminder of the hope that still flickered, even in the darkest of times. She thought of Aldrich's words, his final message to her. "My heart is yours, Isolde. Always." She would carry his heart with her, always. She would carry his love, his courage, his strength within her. She would be the lady he believed she could be, the leader Evermere needed. She dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and took a deep breath. The grief would always be there, a dull ache in her heart, but she would not let it consume her. She had a duty, a responsibility, to her people, to her brother, to Aldrich's memory. She left the solar, her steps firm, her head held high. She had a long road ahead of her, a difficult task to accomplish. But she was not alone. She had Edric, she had her loyal people, and she had the memory of Aldrich's love to guide her. The following days were filled with preparations for Aldrich's funeral. Isolde insisted that he be buried with full honors as a hero of Evermere, as the man who had saved her life, who had saved her brother, who had saved her home. She ordered a tomb to be built for him in the castle chapel, a place of honor, where he could rest in peace, surrounded by the prayers and the gratitude of her people. The funeral was a solemn occasion, attended by all the people of Evermere and by the remaining members of Aldrich's company. They came to pay their respects, to mourn his loss, to honor his memory. Isolde stood before his tomb, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice strong and steady. She spoke of his courage, his loyalty, his sacrifice. She spoke of his love for her, his love for Evermere. She laid a single blue wildflower on his tomb, the same flower he had given her, the flower that reminded her of his eyes. It was a symbol of their love, a love that would endure, even beyond death. After the funeral, Isolde met with the leaders of Aldrich's company. They were preparing to leave Evermere, to return to their own lives, to seek new battles, new fortunes. "We thank you, Lady Isolde, for all you have done," their leader, a grizzled veteran named Harlan, said. "We are forever in your debt." "The debt is all mine," Isolde replied, her eyes searching the remaining faces of the brave men. "Your leader was a good man, a brave knight. I loved him, and I will always be grateful to him, and to all of you. I wish you well." Isolde offered them gold, a substantial sum, as a reward for their service, but they refused it. "We fight for honor," Harlan said, "not for gold." Sir Aldrich would have wanted it that way. They rode away, leaving Isolde alone with her grief, with her memories, with the daunting task of rebuilding her shattered world. The price of freedom had been high, but it had been paid. Evermere was free, but at a cost that would forever haunt her. She would bear that burden, for Aldrich and for her people. The future beckoned, but she knew the road would be hard. Chapter 15. A storm of tears and steel. The weeks that followed Aldrich's funeral were a time of rebuilding, of healing, of mourning. Isolde, with Edric at her side, worked tirelessly to restore Evermere to its former glory. They repaired the damaged fortifications, replenished the depleted supplies, and tended to the needs of their people. But the scars of the battle ran deep, both physical and emotional. The people of Evermere mourned the loss of their loved ones, and the shadow of Morian's occupation still hung heavy over the land. Isolde herself struggled with her grief, the constant ache of Aldrich's absence a reminder of the price of their freedom. One evening, as Isolde was sitting alone in her solar, staring out at the darkening landscape, a storm began to brew. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm mirrored the turmoil within her, the tempest of emotions that she had been trying to suppress. She thought of Aldrich, of his strength, his courage, his tenderness. She remembered his smile, his touch, his voice, the feeling of safety and security she had found in his embrace. She longed for him. ached for him with a depth of emotion that was almost unbearable. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain that streaked the window panes. She allowed herself to grieve, to mourn, to release the pent-up emotions that she had been holding back for so long. As the storm raged outside, Isolde wept. She wept for Aldrich, for their lost love, for the future they would never share. She wept for Evermere, for its people, for the sacrifices they had made. She wept for herself, for the burden she carried, for the loneliness she felt. The storm continued for hours, a relentless onslaught of wind and rain. But as the night wore on, the intensity of the storm began to subside. The wind died down, the rain softened, and the thunder faded into the distance. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, refreshed, renewed. The sun rose, casting a golden glow over the landscape, illuminating the glistening leaves, the sparkling raindrops, the renewed beauty of the world. Isolde stood at the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape. She felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace that she had not expected. The storm had cleansed her, washed away her tears, and renewed her spirit. She knew that the grief would always be there, a dull ache in her heart, but she also knew that she could not let it consume her. She had a duty, a responsibility, to her people, to her brother, to Aldrich's memory. She dressed, her movements purposeful, her head held high. She would face the day, she would face the future, with strength, with courage, with determination. As she left her chamber, she was met by Edric, his face etched with concern. "Isolde," he said softly. "Are you all right? I heard you during the storm." She nodded, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "I am better now," she said. The storm had helped. He understood. He had also grieved in his own way for Aldrich, for the loss of a friend, a comrade, a hero. They walked together to the great hall, where the people of Evermere were gathered for the morning meal. Isolde addressed them, her voice strong and clear, her eyes filled with compassion. "My people," she said, "we have endured much. We have suffered loss, we have faced hardship, we have overcome adversity. But we are not defeated. We are Evermere, and we will endure." She spoke of the need to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. She spoke of the importance of unity, of loyalty, of community. She spoke of her vision for the future, a future of peace, of prosperity, of justice. Her words inspired them, renewed their hope, strengthened their resolve. They cheered her, their voices filled with gratitude, with admiration, with love. But as Isolde looked out at their faces, she saw a flicker of fear, a hint of uncertainty. She knew that the threat of Morian was not entirely gone. He had been defeated, but not destroyed. He still lived, still plotted, still lusted for power. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, a messenger arrived, breathless, his face pale with fear. "My lady," he said, "Morian, he is marching on Evermere again. He has gathered a new army, larger than before. He is seeking revenge." Isolde's heart sank. She had hoped for peace, for a respite from the endless cycle of violence and war. But it was not to be. She looked at Edric, her eyes meeting his. They both knew what this meant. Another battle, another struggle, another test of their strength, their courage, their resolve. Isolde drew a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Let him come," she said, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We will be ready." She turned to her people, her voice ringing out across the hall. "Prepare for battle," she shouted. "We will defend Evermere. We will fight for our freedom. We will not yield." Her words were met with a roar of approval, a surge of determination. The people of Evermere, inspired by her courage, her leadership, were ready to fight, to defend their home, to protect their lady. Isolde, armed with Aldrich's sword and fueled by his memory, prepared to lead her people into battle once more. The storm of tears had passed, but the storm of steel was about to begin. Chapter 16. The Raven's Prophecy. The news of Morian's impending attack spread through Evermere like wildfire, igniting a mixture of fear and determination among the people. They had hoped for peace, for a respite from the endless cycle of violence, but they knew that they had to fight, to defend their home, their freedom, their lady. Isolde, despite her own apprehension, projected an aura of calm confidence, inspiring her people, rallying their spirits, preparing them for the battle to come. She worked tirelessly, overseeing the defenses of the castle, organizing her troops, and planning her strategy. Edric, as always, was her steadfast companion, her trusted advisor, her right hand. He shared her burden, her responsibilities, her fears, and he offered her his unwavering support, his strength, his love. As they prepared for battle, Isolde found herself thinking of Aldrich, of his wisdom, his experience, his strategic mind. She wished he were there, by her side, to guide her, to advise her, to protect her. She remembered his words, his lessons, his teachings. She recalled his tactical brilliance, his ability to anticipate his enemy's moves, his knack for turning a disadvantage into an advantage. She decided to consult the old texts, the ancient scrolls that chronicled the history of Evermere, the battles that had been fought, the strategies that had been employed. She searched for clues, for inspiration, for guidance. In one of the oldest scrolls, she found a passage that caught her attention. It spoke of a prophecy, a legend, a tale of a raven that would appear before a great battle, a raven that would foretell the outcome of the conflict. The prophecy stated that if the raven flew to the east, it signified victory. If it flew to the west, it signified defeat. And if it circled the castle 3 times, it signified a great sacrifice, a heavy loss, but ultimately, a triumph born of courage and resilience. Isolde, though skeptical of prophecies and legends, found herself intrigued by the tale. She had always been a pragmatic woman, a realist, but the recent events, the loss of Aldrich, the constant threat of war, had opened her mind to the possibility of something beyond the realm of logic and reason. She decided to share the prophecy with Edric, seeking his opinion, his perspective. He listened intently, his face thoughtful, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It is just a legend, Isolde," he said. "A tale told to inspire hope or instill fear." "I know," she replied. "But what if there is some truth to it? What if the raven is a sign, a warning, a guide?" Edric hesitated, his gaze flickering between Isolde and the window, as if searching for the raven in the darkening sky. "We cannot rely on prophecies, Isolde," he said. "We must rely on our own strength, our own courage, our own strategy." "I know," she repeated, "but I cannot help but wonder. I cannot help but hope." As if in answer to her words, a shadow passed by the window, a dark shape against the twilight sky. Isolde and Edric both turned, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on the window. A raven, large and black, perched on the windowsill, its obsidian eyes gleaming in the fading light. It was a magnificent creature, its feathers sleek and glossy, its presence both ominous and majestic. Isolde and Edric stared at the raven, their breaths held captive in their chests. The prophecy, the legend, was coming to life before their very eyes. The raven remained still for a moment, its gaze fixed on Isolde, as if studying her, assessing her, judging her. Then, it spread its wings, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its feathers. It took flight, circling the castle once, twice, and then a 3rd time. Isolde's heart sank. The prophecy had been fulfilled. A great sacrifice, a heavy loss, but ultimately, a triumph. Edric placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "We will face whatever comes, Isolde," he said. "Together." She nodded, her tears falling freely now. She knew that the battle ahead would be fierce and bloody, that many lives would be lost, that she might not survive. But she also knew that she had to fight, for Evermere, for her people, for Aldrich's memory. She would make the sacrifice, whatever it may be. The raven, its prophecy delivered, flew away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Isolde and Edric to face their destiny, to confront the storm that was about to break upon them. The circling of the raven cast a long shadow, but Isolde had a duty, and she would not shrink from it. Chapter 17. Beyond the Castle Walls. The days leading up to Morian's attack were filled with a tense anticipation. The people of Evermere, aware of the Raven's prophecy, worked tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable battle. They fortified the castle walls, sharpened their weapons, and drilled in the courtyard, their movements precise, their faces determined. Isolde, despite the weight of the prophecy, remained a beacon of strength and resolve. She moved among her people, offering words of encouragement, sharing their fears, and inspiring them with her unwavering courage. She was their lady, their protector, their leader, and she would not let them down. She spent hours studying the maps of Evermere, analyzing the terrain, planning her strategy, trying to anticipate Morian's moves. She knew that he would be expecting a direct assault, a frontal attack on the castle walls. She had to find a way to surprise him, to outmaneuver him, to exploit his weaknesses. She decided on a daring plan, a risky maneuver that relied on deception and speed. She would divide her forces, sending a small contingent outside the castle walls to harass Morian's army, to disrupt his supply lines, to draw his attention away from the main force within the castle. It was a dangerous strategy, placing a small group of soldiers in harm's way, but Isolde believed it was their best chance of success. She chose Edric to lead the outside force, trusting in his courage, his skill, his loyalty. Edric, though apprehensive about leaving Isolde's side, accepted the assignment without hesitation. He knew that it was his duty, his responsibility, to protect Evermere, to defend his sister, to fight for their freedom. As the day of the battle approached, Isolde found herself drawn to the castle chapel, the place where Aldrich was buried, the sanctuary where she had often sought solace in the past. She knelt before his tomb, her heart heavy with grief, her mind filled with memories. She spoke to him, silently, in her heart, telling him of her fears, her hopes, her plans. She asked for his guidance, his strength, his protection. She promised him that she would fight bravely, that she would honor his memory, that she would never forget him. As she knelt there, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of calm, that she had not expected. She felt Aldrich's presence, his spirit, his love, surrounding her, comforting her, guiding her. She rose to her feet, her heart still heavy, but her resolve strengthened. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the storm, to fight for Evermere. The next morning, as the sun rose, casting a pale light over the landscape, Morian's army appeared on the horizon, a vast sea of soldiers, their banners flying high, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. They were a formidable force, larger than before, their numbers seemingly endless. Isolde stood on the castle walls, her gaze fixed on the approaching enemy, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She wore Aldrich's sword at her side, its weight a constant reminder of his sacrifice, his love, his legacy. She watched as Edric led his small contingent of soldiers out of the castle gates, their movements swift and silent, disappearing into the surrounding forests. They were the bait, the diversion, the sacrifice. Isolde turned to her remaining forces, her voice ringing out across the courtyard. "Soldiers of Evermere," she shouted. "Today we fight for our home, for our freedom, for our future. We will not yield. We will not surrender. We will fight to the last." Her words were met with a roar of approval, a surge of determination. The people of Evermere, inspired by her courage, her leadership, were ready to fight, to defend their home, to protect their lady. The battle began. Morian's army launched a full-scale assault on the castle walls, their siege engines hurling massive stones, their archers raining down a hail of arrows. The defenders of Evermere responded with a fierce barrage of their own, their catapults launching fiery projectiles, their archers picking off enemy soldiers with deadly accuracy. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the clang of steel on steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of the siege engines, the thunder of hooves. The castle walls shook under the relentless assault, but they held firm. Isolde moved among her troops, directing their fire, encouraging their efforts, rallying their spirits. She fought bravely, her sword flashing in the sunlight, her movements precise, her determination unwavering. But as the battle raged, Isolde could not shake the feeling of dread, the premonition of loss that the raven's prophecy had foretold. She knew that a great sacrifice was coming, a heavy price to be paid for their freedom. She looked out at the battlefield, searching for Edric, for his small contingent of soldiers, praying for their safety, their survival. But she could not see them. They were beyond the castle walls, lost in the chaos of the battle, fighting their own desperate struggle. She feared the worst. Chapter 18. The Heart's True North. The battle raged on, a maelstrom of violence and chaos. Isolde fought with a fierce determination, her sword a blur of motion, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She moved along the castle walls, directing her troops, encouraging their efforts, and rallying their spirits. But despite her best efforts, Morian's forces were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. The siege engines continued to hurl massive stones against the castle walls, creating breaches in the defenses. Enemy soldiers began to scale the walls, using ladders and grappling hooks, engaging the defenders in hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, a desperate struggle for survival. Isolde saw many of her brave soldiers fall, their bodies littering the battlements. The sight filled her with grief and rage, fueling her determination to fight on, to avenge their deaths, to protect Evermere. She had thought it was Edric the prophecy was pointing at. Suddenly, a cry rang out, a cry of alarm, a cry of despair. They have breached the gate. Isolde's heart sank. The main gate, the strongest point of the castle's defenses, had been breached. Enemy soldiers were pouring into the courtyard, overwhelming the defenders, pushing them back towards the inner keep. The battle was turning against them. Isolde knew that they were on the verge of defeat. But she refused to surrender. She would fight to the last, defending Evermere, honoring Aldric's memory, protecting her people. She rallied her remaining troops, forming a tight circle around the entrance to the inner keep. They fought bravely, desperately, but the enemy soldiers were too numerous, too strong. They were slowly being pushed back, inch by inch, towards their final stand. As Isolde fought, she saw a familiar figure emerging from the chaos, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grim face and a determined gaze. It was Edric, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his sword dripping with the blood of his enemies. He had returned, against all odds. He fought his way to her side, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Isolde," he shouted. "Are you all right?" "I am," she replied, her voice hoarse but strong. "But we are losing Edric. We cannot hold them back." He nodded, his face grim. "I know," he said, "but we will not surrender. We will fight to the end." They stood together, back to back, their swords raised, ready to face the inevitable. The enemy soldiers surrounded them, their faces filled with hatred and triumph. But then, something unexpected happened. From beyond the castle walls, a horn blew, a loud, clear blast that echoed across the battlefield. The enemy soldiers hesitated, their attack faltering. Isolde and Edric looked at each other, their hearts pounding, their eyes filled with a flicker of hope. It was the signal that Edric had arranged with his outside force. From the forest surrounding the castle, a wave of soldiers emerged, charging towards the rear of Morian's army. They were Edric's men, reinforced by allies from neighboring lands, allies that Isolde had secretly secured through weeks of careful diplomacy. The surprise attack caught Morian's forces off guard. They were trapped between two forces, caught in a pincer movement, unable to escape. The tide of the battle turned, dramatically and decisively. The defenders of Evermere, renewed by the arrival of reinforcements, fought with a renewed vigor, pushing back the enemy soldiers, driving them out of the castle. Isolde and Edric, fighting side by side, led the charge, their swords a blur of motion, their hearts filled with a surge of triumph. They fought their way through the enemy ranks, clearing a path towards Morian, who stood on a nearby hill, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Morian saw them coming, his eyes widening with fear. He turned to flee, but it was too late. Isolde and Edric reached him, their swords raised, their faces grim and determined. "It is over, Morian," Isolde said, her voice cold and steady. "Surrender, or die." Morian hesitated, his gaze flickering between Isolde and Edric, his hand trembling on the hilt of his sword. He knew that he was defeated, that his ambition had led him to ruin. He lowered his sword, a gesture of surrender, a sign of defeat. The battle was over. Evermere was free. Isolde looked at Edric, her eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. They had done it. They had saved Evermere against all odds. But as they stood there, amidst the carnage of the battlefield, Isolde felt a pang of sorrow, a reminder of the Raven's prophecy. A great sacrifice, a heavy loss, but ultimately, a triumph. The sacrifice had not been Edric, as she had feared. It had been Aldrich, his life given to save hers, to save Evermere. And the triumph was theirs, but it was bittersweet, tinged with the sorrow of his loss. She realized that while duty and honor pointed her towards her responsibilities, her heart's compass pointed towards love, loss, and remembrance of Aldrich. The heart's true north, for her, would always be marked by his memory. She would never forget. Chapter 19. A Tapestry of Scars. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of both relief and devastation. The people of Evermere emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of joy and sorrow. They had survived, they had won, but the cost had been heavy. The courtyard of the castle was littered with the bodies of the dead, both friend and foe. The air was thick with the stench of blood and smoke, the silence broken only by the cries of the wounded and the sobs of the bereaved. Isolde and Edric moved among their people, offering comfort, tending to the injured, and directing the cleanup efforts. They worked tirelessly, their own grief and exhaustion overshadowed by their duty to their people. Morian was taken prisoner, his ambition crushed, his dreams of conquest shattered. He was imprisoned in the deepest dungeon of the castle, awaiting Isolde's judgment. The allied forces that had come to Evermere's aid were hailed as heroes, their bravery and loyalty celebrated with feasts and festivities. But even amidst the celebrations, the shadow of loss hung heavy over the land. Isolde, despite her outward composure, was struggling with her own grief. Aldrich's absence was a constant ache in her heart, a void that could never be filled. She found herself drawn to the places where they had spent time together, the chapel where he was buried, the battlements where they had stood side by side, the solar where she had read his letter. She would often sit alone, in the quiet solitude of her chamber, clutching his letter to her chest, rereading his words, reliving their memories. She found solace in his words, in his love, in his memory. One evening, as she was sitting by the window, gazing out at the starry sky, Edric came to see her. He looked weary, his face etched with concern. "Isolde," he said softly, "you cannot continue like this. You are grieving, I know, but you must also live. You must rule. You must lead." She nodded, her tears falling silently. "I know," she whispered, "but it is so hard, Edric. I miss him so much." He sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, offering her comfort and support. "I miss him too," he said. "He was a good man, a true friend. But he would not want you to wither away in grief. He would want you to be strong, to be happy, to live your life to the fullest." His words resonated with her, stirring a flicker of resolve within her. He was right. Aldrich would not want her to mourn forever. He would want her to carry on, to rebuild Evermere, to lead her people with strength and compassion. "Thank you, Edric," she said, her voice stronger now. "You are right. I will try." She made a conscious effort to move forward, to embrace life, to fulfill her duties as Lady of Evermere. She worked tirelessly, rebuilding the castle, restoring order, and dispensing justice. She dealt with Morian, deciding his fate with a mixture of firmness and compassion. She spared his life, but she banished him from Evermere, stripping him of his titles, his lands, his power. She also addressed the issue of Alara, the traitor who had caused so much pain and suffering. She summoned Alara from the dungeon, facing her former friend with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Alara looked haggard, her eyes filled with remorse, her spirit broken. She pleaded for forgiveness, begging Isolde to spare her life. Isolde, remembering Aldrich's words about mercy and justice, listened to Alara's plea, her heart torn between her desire for vengeance and her compassion for a woman who had once been her friend. She ultimately decided to show mercy. She spared Alara's life, but she banished her from Evermere forever. It was a difficult decision, but it was the right one, a decision that honored both justice and compassion. As the weeks turned into months, Evermere began to heal. The scars of the battle remained, but the people of Evermere, inspired by Isolde's leadership, worked together to rebuild their home, their lives, their future. Isolde, though still grieving for Aldrich, found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose, in her role as Lady of Evermere. She ruled wisely and justly, her decisions guided by compassion, by wisdom, by the memory of Aldrich's love. She never forgot him. She wore his sword, she kept his letter close to her heart, and she often visited his tomb in the chapel, seeking solace in his memory, in his spirit. The tapestry of her life was woven with scars, with loss, with grief. But it was also woven with threads of courage, of resilience, of hope. She had survived, she had endured, she had triumphed. And she would continue to do so, for Evermere, for her people, for Aldrich's memory. She had built a new life from the ashes of war. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Years passed, and Evermere prospered under Isolde's wise and compassionate rule. The scars of the battles, both physical and emotional, began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace, of stability, of renewed hope. Isolde had proven to be a strong and effective leader, her decisions guided by justice, by wisdom, and by the memory of Aldrich's love. She had rebuilt the castle, strengthened the defenses, and fostered a sense of unity and loyalty among her people. Edric, her steadfast companion and trusted advisor, had remained by her side, supporting her, guiding her, sharing her burdens and her triumphs. He had married a noblewoman from a neighboring land, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who brought joy and laughter to the castle. Isolde, though content in her role as Lady of Evermere, still carried the weight of Aldrich's loss. She had never forgotten him, and she had never loved another. His memory was a constant presence in her life, a guiding star, a source of strength and inspiration. One spring morning, as Isolde was walking through the castle gardens, enjoying the beauty of the blooming flowers and the warmth of the sun, she was approached by a messenger, a young man with a familiar face. "My lady," he said, bowing respectfully, "I bring a message from Lord Harlan, of Aldrich's former company." Isolde's heart skipped a beat. Harlan. It had been years since she had last seen him, since he and his men had ridden away from Evermere, refusing her offer of gold, choosing to honor Aldrich's memory by fighting for honor, not for reward. "What is the message?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Lord Harlan requests an audience with you, my lady," the messenger said. "He says it is a matter of great importance, concerning Sir Aldrich Blackwell." Isolde's breath caught in her throat. Aldrich. After all these years. What could it possibly be? "Tell Lord Harlan that I will receive him," she said, her voice firm, despite the turmoil of emotions that surged within her. The messenger bowed and departed, leaving Isolde to grapple with a mixture of anticipation, apprehension, and a flicker of hope that she had long thought extinguished. Later that day, Harlan was ushered into Isolde's solar, his face weathered and scarred, but his eyes still sharp and intelligent. He bowed respectfully, his movements stiff but graceful. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "I thank you for receiving me." "Lord Harlan," she replied, her voice steady. "You said your message concerned Sir Aldrich. What is it?" Harlan hesitated, his gaze flickering between Isolde and the window, as if searching for the right words. "My lady," he began, his voice low. "After we left Evermere, we continued our service as mercenaries, fighting in various battles across many lands. Isolde nodded, listening intently. Several months ago, Harlan continued, we were engaged in a campaign in the far north, a brutal and bloody conflict against a savage tribe of warriors. He paused, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. During one particularly fierce battle, he said, we encountered a warrior, a man of extraordinary skill and courage, a man who fought with a ferocity that reminded us of Sir Aldrich. Isolde's heart leaped into her throat. She could barely breathe. This warrior, Harlan continued, was wounded, badly wounded. We captured him, and we brought him back to our camp, intending to interrogate him. He paused again, his gaze meeting Isolde's, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of awe and wonder. As we tended to his wounds, he said, we discovered a birthmark on his shoulder. A mark that was identical to the one described to us by Sir Aldrich many years ago. A mark that identified him as a member of his family, a family he believed had been lost, a family he had long mourned. Isolde's mind reeled. She could not comprehend what Harlan was saying. It was impossible, unbelievable. And, she whispered, her voice trembling. And, Harlan said, his voice filled with emotion, we discovered that this warrior was not a member of the enemy tribe. He was Sir Aldrich Blackwell. Isolde gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Aldrich? She whispered. Alive? Harlan nodded. Alive, my lady, he said, though gravely wounded. He had lost his memory, my lady. The blow to the head during the battle at Evermere. He had been taken in and raised by a different clan. Isolde stared at him, stunned, speechless, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of his words. Aldrich. Alive. After all these years. It was a miracle, a dream come true, a prayer answered. Where is he? She asked, her voice urgent, her heart pounding. Where is Aldrich? He is here, my lady, Harlan said. He is waiting outside. He is not the same man he was. The years, the battles, the loss of memory, they have changed him. But he is Aldrich. Isolde rose from her chair, her legs trembling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy, relief, and a profound sense of disbelief. She had to see him, to touch him, to know that it was real. She followed Harlan out of the solar, into the courtyard, where a small group of men were waiting. And there, standing among them, was a man she had thought lost forever, a man she had loved with all her heart, a man who had haunted her dreams for years. He was older, his face weathered and scarred, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. But it was him. It was Aldrich. She walked towards him, her step slow and hesitant, her eyes fixed on his face, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers, a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of memory, dawning in his eyes. Isolde? He whispered, his voice hoarse, uncertain. Aldrich, she replied, her voice choked with emotion, her tears streaming down her face. It is you. It is really you. She reached out, her hand touching his face, tracing the lines of his scars, feeling the warmth of his skin. He was real. He was alive. He took her hand in his grip strong and firm, despite his weakened state. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the years, the battles, the loss of memory. Isolde, he whispered again, his voice filled with emotion. I remember. And in that moment, the years of separation, the pain of loss, the burden of duty, all melted away. They were together again, reunited by a twist of fate, by a miracle of love, by a bond that had never truly been broken. The reckoning of love and duty had come, and love had won. The past was behind them, scars and all. Epilogue. The return of Aldrich was a joyous occasion, celebrated throughout Evermere with feasts, festivities, and an outpouring of relief and gratitude. The people, who had long mourned his loss, rejoiced at his miraculous return, hailing him as a hero, a legend, a symbol of hope. Isolde, her heart overflowing with happiness, tended to Aldrich's wounds, both physical and emotional. She nursed him back to health, patiently helping him to recover his memories, to piece together the fragments of his past, to rediscover the man he once was. It was a slow and gradual process, filled with challenges and setbacks. Aldrich struggled with the gaps in his memory, with the trauma of his experiences, with the weight of his rediscovered identity. But Isolde was always there, by his side, offering him her unwavering love, her support, her understanding. As Aldrich's memories returned, so too did his love for Isolde. It was a love that had endured the years, the battles, the loss of memory, a love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and uncertainty, a love that was stronger and deeper than ever before. They were married in the castle chapel, the same chapel where Aldrich had been buried, the same chapel where Isolde had prayed for his return. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Edric and his family, by Harlan and his men, and by the loyal people of Evermere. Isolde wore a gown of white silk, embroidered with the falcon of Evermere and the single, blue wildflower that Aldrich had given her so many years ago. Aldrich wore his old armor, polished and gleaming, the symbol of his knighthood, his honor, his courage. They exchanged vows, their voices filled with emotion, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and commitment. They were no longer just lady and knight, bound by duty and circumstance. They were husband and wife, bound by a love that had conquered all, a love that had defied death itself. After the ceremony, they walked hand in hand through the castle gardens, the same gardens where Isolde had received the news of Aldrich's return, the same gardens where they had shared their first kiss, so many years ago. "I never thought I would see you again," Isolde said, her voice filled with wonder. "I thought I had lost you forever." Aldrich smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand squeezing hers.
"I was lost," he said. "But you found me. You brought me back."
They stopped beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky, its roots firmly planted in the earth. It was a symbol of strength, of resilience, of enduring love. "What will you do now?" Isolde asked, her voice soft, curious. "Will you return to your life as a mercenary?" Aldrich shook his head.
"No," he said.
"My fighting days are over. I have found my home, my love, my purpose. I will stay here, with you in Evermere." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that was both tender and fierce. "I will serve you, my lady," he said. "As your husband, as your protector, as your friend. Always." Isolde smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness.
"And I will serve you, my knight," she said.
"As your wife, as your love, as your companion. Always." They kissed a long, tender kiss that sealed their vows, their love, their future. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of hope. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness, of peace, of enduring love. And so, Isolde and Aldrich, the lady and the knight, lived out their days in Evermere, ruling wisely and justly, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, a symbol of a love that had conquered all. The tapestry of their lives, once woven with scars and loss, was now rich with the vibrant colors of joy, companionship, and an enduring love that would last for all time. They had built a life and a legacy together.